Colleagues, so I quickly want to go through those two sections where there's a narrative assessment and a systemic assessment. Okay, so I think the narrative assessment you've done quite well. All of you understand that. You've identified the losses, narratives of violence as well. I think all of you identified the losses quite well. And please go back to the notes that your fellow colleagues has made in the class as well. I can go through these notes in terms of what struck me, but let me just first explain that. So listen to narrative themes in the story of Antoine Fisher of loss, violence, and then coping. And you've all kind of identified and explained that, even identified the causes of it and so forth. So I think that section you are well aware of. Just know the difference between the narrative assessments and then the systemic assessment, which I'll get to now. And all of you have said, or most of you have said, that you struggled a little bit with the systemic assessments. So remember, here as Doering says as well, caregivers listen for the lived theologies embedded in care seekers' narratives. Many lived theologies are energized and held together by emotions, in some cases, fear, shame, guilt, and or anger that make up the vulnerable underside of these lived theologies. So listening for themes could easily become a toolbox approach. Culture predisposes us to simplistic ways of listening thematically. News stories, for example, are often organized sensationally around losses and traumas, as though such events account for every aspect of suffering. All right. So here again is that reference to respecting the mystery of the other or alterity. Now, and remember when Doering speaks about intercultural approach, she's not using this terminology in the pure superficial cultural meaning as we understand it. So it's not about different ethnicities and cultures and countries and so forth. It is about the otherness. Even with people who share your religion, share your race, share a lot of the intersectionalities in your identities. The point here is that we as caregivers should approach someone as if we do not know anything, as if we do not understand their lives, their stories, their backgrounds, their environments, because that tunes us to listening carefully to the things that we often assume. We are very quick to make assumptions, and what she says here is hold back your assumptions and listen carefully. Listen as if you know nothing. Listen as if this person across of you isn't also a female, white, Afrikaans speaking, living in South Africa, Bloemfontein, and a Christian. Listen to the things that makes her different from me. That is the interculturality of Doering's approach. So when you listen to narrative themes of loss, violence, and coping, do not only listen to what you see superficially on the movie. As I said to you, anger, for instance. Anger is a narrative of violence in Antoine's story. Violence is a theme in Antoine's story. But there are also underlying themes that causes this violence, even for the people that perpetrated the violence against him. But there might be narratives of violence that you describe, like the violence he perpetrated, and then that was perpetrated against him. But then listen from that narrative of violence, listen to the losses, because violence is often a response to an experienced loss. So what narratives of losses are there? But as I said, I'm not going to spend too much time on that, because I know that you have described and identified that, I think, sufficiently, all of you. But let's go to the systemic assessment. Now, she says here, in Chapter 5, we listen for the theological ways of understanding suffering. In Chapter 6, we paid attention to the themes in a care seeker story, that is loss, violence, and coping. And in this chapter, we will describe another way of listening introduced in Chapter 1, listening for how social systems intersect to afford or deny social privileges, either opening or closing doors. Caregivers listen self-reflexively by tracking how their own intersecting social privileges and disadvantages shape how they react to the care seeker story. So there's two positions that you need to take here. Firstly, when you listen to the care seeker story, you have to, perhaps afterwards, first assess your own position of privilege or disadvantage, because that will influence your perception and understanding of that person's disadvantage or privilege. So if we cannot identify our own position, where we are coming from, and what has disadvantaged us, and what has privileged us, and how these influence what we hear and what we understand, we won't be able to clearly see the systemic influence of the care seeker. So she continues, they also assess the role of the care seeker's closest relationships, current family, family of origin, communities, and culture. In what ways do these relational systems help care seekers cope with or resist social oppression? So this is the question that you will ask. Oh my goodness, where am I now? This is the question that you ask yourself while listening to the story, and that you ask yourself while assessing your own privilege or disadvantage. So in what ways do these relational systems help care seekers cope with or resist social oppression? All right. To what extent do these relational systems compound social oppression? Let us begin to consider these questions through the narrative of a young Mexican woman. And I want you to go read that narrative, because her assessment at the end will give you a clear understanding of what she means. So, intersecting social oppression. We will see the diagram now, but on the following page, conjectures on intersecting social systems that afford or deny social privileges and shape Yadira's identity and lived theology in this moment of crisis. So what Doring did is she created an illustration, again, to show her understanding of the social oppression, advantage or disadvantage that Yadira has experienced. Right, so here is that illustration. So you will see that she does the systemic assessment, and this is quite important, because I must tell you, I've heard very little of this embedded beliefs, values, emotions and coping styles, and deliberate theologies and embedded theologies from what you've said in your presentations. And you must remember, this module or this book starts with that. So you have to, before listening to anyone's story, you would have already made an assessment in terms of what are the embedded values and beliefs of this person, what coping style is this person using, what emotions sprung up, both negative and positive, how does it influence his or her lived theology, is it life-giving, is it life-limiting, and so forth. So you'll see Yadira is here at the center, and she says Yadira's embodied lived theology. Embodied lived theology. So currently this is where she is at. This is a state of her embodied theology. This is not now yet moving here to a possible life-giving intentional theology. So embodied lived theology indicates response. A person is responding in terms of her, let's say in her case, her theology to her experiences. But these are not intentional. So these kind of were automatically created unconsciously, and this is what she is living at the moment. But the whole goal and idea of care seeking and caregiving is to move to a place where we intentionally create life-giving theologies. Now, this can be a possible goal for the plan of care. You understand? So when you start with someone, there should be a goal in mind in your plan of care. And according to this module and these themes, our goal should be creating intentionally life-giving theologies. So what has she identified as Yadira's disadvantages? So she states here the prejudice related to citizenship status in America because she's from Mexico. She's identified racism within a community, and here she's made little notes of evidence if you want. Sexism within the community, and then classism within the community. Now, you can see here that this one, for instance, she says here, V, family responsibility, family loyalty, privacy, self-reliance, achievement, higher education. Then B, staying hidden is the only way to be safe. It is my fault if I get caught. So that's kind of a embodied theology that she is living. And C, reserved. Don't show strong emotions, focusing on studies. Okay, so this is kind of her emotions. So here it is, emotions, values, beliefs, and coping mechanisms. Her coping mechanism here is staying hidden, as it's the only way to be safe. And she believes, this is a belief, that it will be her fault if she get caught. Values is a responsibility towards her family, loyalty, privacy, self-reliance, achievement. And then C, which is coping mechanisms, is to be reserved, not much tension on myself, putting all my energy into my studies, not thinking much about how these disadvantages are influencing my embedded theology. All right, so this is a kind of a nice indication. So the diagram above attempts to represent these intersecting social systems of oppression, conjecturing how these might shape Yadira's lived theology represented by the inner box. This is the embodied theology that is grounded in her body and emotions. She probably experienced fear about her citizenship status jeopardizing her future. An ironic twist to her educational sponsor is that he is a prominent local Republican. Now, one wonders how he would react if he knew her citizenship. She never disclosed the lack of citizenship to faculty advisors who encouraged her to pursue graduate studies. All right. So she explains the story here, and you can read through that. But this should give you an idea. Monitoring the caregiver's intersecting social privileges. So now you've looked at the disadvantages, now let's look at the privileges. So knowing that I'm likely to hear Yadira's story through the lenses of my social location, I use the same chart below to detail how these social systems intersect for me. And that is now for Durin. My intersecting social privileges might generate an automatic life-limiting theology through which I judge someone like Yadira. After trying to identify the life-limiting lived theology that might be triggered by emotions like fear, guilt, helplessness, I try to identify an intentional theology based on values I want to live out in relation to someone like Yadira. This intentional theology could be used to identify emotional triggers and counteract my prejudiced lived theology. Now, this is a perfect example of what happened between Antoine and Davenport. No? So, we say, and you've all identified that reciprocating nature between Davenport and Antoine Fisher. So, but you also said that, we cannot pinpoint exactly how Davenport was changed. And although Davenport obviously didn't use this and didn't think intentionally about his privileges and disadvantages and so forth, this is suggested here now. One can almost see how Davenport tries to look at Antoine to understand him, and one can say his theology, his lived theology, through the lenses of Antoine's life, disadvantages and prejudices, and not through the privileges of Davenport. Because Davenport was in many ways in a privileged position. Why? He was a high-ranking officer in the Navy, as a psychiatrist. He has a family, an intact family. He probably comes from a good family as well. I'm not sure, but that is what I assume. He is married. He lives I would say, a decent and a moral life. And he did not experience the abuse. We assume that as well now from the movie that Antoine did. And Davenport, this means Davenport had to at least momentarily get out of this position of privilege to understand the reactions and the anger and the thinking of Antoine so that they can develop an intentional theology together. And this is what she is now saying as well. So it's not necessarily the privilege of the care seeker, but the privilege of the caregiver. Why again? Because it influences what I hear and how I understand it, and then also how I can journey with someone to the future. So let's look at this diagram, because this is exactly what it is. So it says here, caregivers, life-limiting embodied lived theology concerning those like Yadira. So this is now what During did to analyze or assess her own life-limiting embodied lived theology that might be created in response to Yadira's position, story, and embedded or embodied theology. So she says here, the emotions is trauma related to fear and shame related to a family member which with mentally illness, breaking the law and getting caught in the criminal system, past guilt about how to balance family, school, and professional responsibilities, helplessness about how to help those like Yadira. And that often happens. Now you hear someone's story, you think, oh my goodness, I don't know how I can help this because I do not nearly have the same experience. Or you might sit in front of someone who is a drug abuser, and you might think, our first response is to judge, and if he only made better decisions or so forth. So those things, your emotions towards that person's story should be assessed. Then in terms of value, she says responsibility. So that is the value she has, a responsibility for the care seeker as well. Independence, that is self-reliance, so her own self-reliance. And then also not to shove that onto Yadira and say, because I'm independent and self-reliant, you should also be there. Because it might not be possible for Yadira. There's a whole lot of factors that influence our sense of agency and self-reliance. Achievements, it's up to each person to work hard and get help. You see, that is a prejudice that you might have. It's your responsibility to find help or help yourself. And then also health, a privilege of being healthy and not being ill. Then B, which is then the beliefs, is a simple moral theology, is to work hard and get rewarded. So this is her embedded theology. It's a simple moral theology. If you work hard, you will get rewarded, which we know, unfortunately, isn't always the case. Suffering results from personal wrongdoings. So that might be a judgment you carry with yourself as well. You are punished because you did ABC, or you're on the wrong side of the law, or blah, blah, blah. So God is punishing you. That is a belief that needs to be assessed. And then C, which is coping, is withdrawal from those like Yadira because of empathic distress. So it can happen that you as a caregiver feel, I'm distressed now because I do not know how to handle this person. I do not know how to journey with this person. I don't know what answers to give to this person because our lives and our stories are just so far apart away. So I would rather kind of withdraw and refer because I'm scared of doing that. So confronting your fears and your prejudices and your disadvantages or your life-limiting theologies with regards to the story of the care seeker, that's very important. I'm going to say that again, is extremely important. So in your plan of care, I would like you now to also include this. Before you start a plan, this should be part of your plan. So there's a section of your plan of care that you say, you assess Antoine, sorry, whatever, but there should be a section that you assess your own privileges and disadvantages in terms of, or in the framework of Antoine's story as well. And then the life-giving intentional theology concerning veterans. So the possible life-giving theology that you as a care seeker, which during that year she changed that life-limiting theologies into a life-giving intentional theology. So after she assessed her own shortcomings, she said, okay, but I'm going to intentionally react in the following way, intentionally hold these values, intentionally hold these beliefs, so that I can intentionally help Yadira to cope. All right, and what she said here is emotions. She will intentionally have compassion, sadness, and anger with Yadira. Her values is her spirituality, her interdependence. In other words, me as a care seeker, a caregiver, is also dependent on the care seeker, and that we clearly saw between Davenport and Antoine. And you will also have that, because we also learn something, grow in a certain way in interaction. So there's, in all therapy or caregiving activities, there will be interdependence, a sense of belonging as well, and a concern for others. So her beliefs that she intentionally holds is then lament. And what is lament? Lament is to be angry with someone not towards God, but before God. And even cry before God and exclaim the injustices, identify, pinpoint, voice, narrate the injustices, and then, in all humility and vulnerability, kneel before God. It's lamenting, which is a very important spiritual practice for mourning. And then ambiguous suffering within the web of life. Okay, so to understand that there is an ambiguity within suffering and why some people suffer more than other people. And then she intentionally chooses to cope through communal prayer and liturgy, educating myself about those like Yadira, practicing, writing, teaching about intercultural spiritual care and social justice. So this is what you do to cope with the story of the care seeker, so that you can become stronger, so that you can become better, so that you can also learn from that experience. And next time you will be more energized and wise when you get into a similar situation or with the next counselee. So she also looked at her social system in terms of the prejudice that Yadira experienced. So she looked at her own citizenship status, and she said, I am a citizen and I usually take this privilege for granted. My life theology predisposes me to experience automatic unexamined prejudice towards someone like Yadira. Just being that brutally honest. Racism, I grew up with a naive belief in equal opportunity for all. I have benefited from many social advantages. Being Euro-American is easy for me to ignore the privileges of being white. So to acknowledge that as well. Classism, my parents grew up in a working class families during the Depression, and we were able to go to college. My father via the GI Bill. I was on one of the 3 siblings who made it through college. 2 didn't and had considerable social disadvantages as a result. So, and then sexism, I was raised as a girl. When equal opportunities were opening up, I didn't directly experience sexism, no doubt because of my social class and race as well. And to look at that and see, okay, so now I know my position in relation to the position of the care seeker. So that systematic, if you take anything, the gist of the story is that systematic assessment is then held together by the 2 polarities of the care seeker and the caregiver, where the caregiver also reflects on your own privilege in the framework of the disadvantages experienced by the care seeker. And I hope that makes sense. And for Antoine's case, there are many things. Racism is one of them. Poverty is another one. The foster care system. So classism is another one. Being the victim of sexual violence is another one. The social care system that failed him. The healthcare system that failed him. Even the church that failed him. So the spiritual community that failed him. So there are many systemic assessments that led to Antoine experiencing many disadvantages and led to his embedded beliefs and values and coping mechanisms. And you need to assess that. I hope that makes sense.